Tonight at 10, we are live in Ukraine, where Russia has continued its attacks on cities while offering to create safe routes for people to escape. It comes as Ukrainians desperately try to save themselves from Russian bombardments.
It was a really terrible situation because when everything started, our house was like, I don't know how to tell it.
Today, people queued for hours to flee to the west, but Russia's proposed escape routes would take people to Russia itself and to its ally Belarus. The Ukrainian president called this immoral.
And we'll also be looking at developments here in the UK with the latest on visa applications and the effects of the conflict on energy prices. Boris Johnson holds talks with the Prime Ministers of Canada and the Netherlands and says an immediate ban on importing Russian oil and gas would not be a wise move.
What we also need to do is go for more nuclear and much more use of renewable energy. And I'm going to be setting out an energy strategy, an energy supply strategy for the country in the days ahead.
And with more Ukrainian refugees waiting at Calais and thousands applying for UK visas, the government's approach is being widely criticised.
And stay with us on BBC News for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
Good evening from Lviv in western Ukraine on day 12 of the war here. Ukraine has roundly rejected Moscow's idea that Ukrainian civilians fleeing Russian attacks should use humanitarian corridors to seek refuge in either Russia or in its ally Belarus. The government in Kiev said the proposal was completely immoral and that people should be allowed to escape to territory held by the Ukrainian military. Two attempts to evacuate civilians over the weekend ended in failure, with Russia and Ukraine accusing each other of violating a humanitarian ceasefire. Ukrainian authorities say that rocket attacks have continued on residential areas in several cities. A third round of talks between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators today failed to make any real progress. Well, this map shows the areas, seen here in red, where the Russians are now said to be in control. The port of Mariupol, where tens of thousands of civilians are trapped, is especially important, as it ensures Ukraine's access to the Black Sea. The Ministry of Defence says that the 40-mile-long convoy of Russian military vehicles remains close to the capital, Kiev, but has made little progress in recent days. But fighting continues in places like Irpin, which is several miles from the city boundary. Well, our correspondent Orla Guerin reports now from the city of Irpin, which is under heavy bombardment and is crucial to the Russian advance.
The only way out, and he stumbles, hands shaking, but he summons his courage and carries on. The desperate exodus from Irpin today, across the wreckage of a bridge blown up by Ukraine to slow the Russian advance. How scared do you have to be to take your child and flee like this? And here a woman lies conscious, but immobile. She fell and there's no stretcher to move her. Well, this is a difficult journey every step of the way, especially for older people trying to pick their way out across rubble and concrete, having to balance on bits of wood. Ukrainian troops are trying to help them make their way forward. Some are coming with their children. Most are coming with a few small things they can carry. They've been under bombardment in Irpin for days, and they're not safe now, even as they try to leave. The shelling has been continuing. For many civilians in the town, that shelling hit home. like Anastasia, whose son Oleg is just 5 months old. The day before yesterday, a shell hit our house, she tells me. We spent 2 days at my grandmother's. Now we are leaving because it's too dangerous to be in any corner of Irpin with a child. Suddenly, this. Some Ukrainian forces running for cover. Others getting civilians out of the line of fire. Kiev is just half an hour away. If Ukraine loses this town, and it's already lost some of it, the Russians will be on the road to the capital. Andrei, like many here, is begging for a no-fly zone.
Tell everybody to close the sky, urgently. All people need it in Ukraine, really. Many people stay in Irpin for now. They can't go outside. Some old people, some young people, they try to do their best there. But we see the Russian soldiers, they don't fight it with army, they fight it with anyone. So tell please to close the sky.
For now, all many can do is cram into minivans bound for the railway station in the capital. Generations of Ukrainians at the mercy of an increasingly brutal Russian advance. And in the city, outside the registry office, the new soundtrack of Kiev. Not what Kate and Artur had hoped for on their special day. The war has tightened their bond, but upended their lives.
Firstly, it was very scary when it started, but me and my family and me, we're all Christians. We pray to God and we believe that He cares about us and protects us.
And you're getting married today, which is a very hopeful thing to do.
Yeah.
What kind of future do you see for you both?
I see that Ukraine will win and we will help to restore the country and make everything possible to make it new.
There were no guests at the ceremony. It was too dangerous for loved ones to join them. The newlyweds say they'll have a party when Ukraine is victorious. Orla Gearan, BBC News, Kiev.
Well, let's take a closer look now at that proposal by Russia, dismissed by Ukraine, for a number of safe escape routes from key cities. 4 of the 6 suggested safe corridors go to the east, to Russia, or to Belarus, its key ally, to the north. The other 2 routes take those fleeing further into Ukraine. President Zelensky has condemned the proposals as completely immoral. And as our correspondent Sarah Rainsford now reports, people in the cities of Dnipro and Kharkiv are planning their own journeys to safety.
Kharkiv is burning again. A Russian-speaking city, bombed by Russian planes, battered by Russian shells. In a war Vladimir Putin says is to protect Russian speakers. But his troops are destroying their homes and their lives. The woman who filmed this footage told us Ukraine's being punished for its free will and its democracy. Valentina sent her sister and mum to safety today. She told me she wants one thing now, for NATO to stop Russian planes flying over Ukraine. We see them, she said, and it's terrible. We found families from Kharkiv here in Dnipro today, trying to flee even further. But it feels like half this city is now leaving too, lining up for evacuation trains as soon as the curfew lifts.
Shelling, bombing, and really loud in Kharkiv. And it was a really terrible situation because when everything started, our house was like, I don't know how to tell it. It's every time.
Her mum is staying put. though it's breaking her. Ukrainians are still fiercely loyal to their cause, but realistic about the danger now. We've spoken to people in this queue who've been standing here for 6 hours in the cold, in the snow, hoping to get a train out of here to the west and to relative safety. But it's only the women and the children who are being allowed through. The men are being pulled out of the crowd until they have to stay. Families who have no idea when or whether they'll be united again. Paulina had to hug her dad goodbye at the border. We first spoke to her in Kharkiv, but the little girl's now made it to Poland and can get the cancer medicine she needs. So today her mum was able to smile. The only thing is, she sometimes asks where her daddy is, Ksenia tells me, and I don't know what to say to her. But for the first time in 2 weeks, Paulina is playing again. Sarah Rainsford, BBC News, Dnipro.
Well, today the mayor of this city that we're in, Lviv, said that they were at the limit of their capacity for helping people who fled the violence. And since the invasion began just under 2 weeks ago, more than 1.7 million people, most of them women and children, have fled the country, according to the United Nations. They are crossing borders to neighbouring countries to the west, such as Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary and Moldova. It is the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Our correspondent Lucy Williamson is in Moldova, over the border with Ukraine.
These are women who've stayed in Ukraine through more than 10 days of war. They've now decided to leave. It's a long walk from Ukraine's last bus stop to this border. Better to use any vehicle you can. By the time they're here, this conflict has often darkened their cities and their faces. Some had powerful reasons for staying as long as they could. Olga's mother, Nadia, suffered a series of strokes last year. Olga went back to Ukraine in October to look after her. When the war began, she faced a dilemma. Being there was terrifying, she said. We live on the 8th floor. There were sirens day and night. What else could I feel but fear? I couldn't leave her there. I'm all she has. For some, this isn't a one-way journey. Aid workers say women are dropping off their children here before turning round and going straight back to Ukraine.
I will never forget the woman who told me that she is working in the orphanage and she has like 50 children and she cannot leave them there. Or a woman who is working at electric station and also the electric station is responsible for the whole city. And she also said like people are running, so there will be nobody to maintain this the basic needs of the human beings who are staying there.
Moldova is slowly getting organized to handle this influx. Poland has received a far greater number of refugees, but Moldova is a much smaller country without Poland's resources or infrastructure. The number of refugees who have arrived here so far is equivalent to 10% of Moldova's population, though fewer than half end up staying. Refugees arrived here last week in Porsches and SUVs. Now the conflict is forcing the poor, the disabled, the most vulnerable to leave. Those for whom the risks and uncertainty of conflict have only now eclipsed the risks and uncertainty of becoming a refugee. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Moldova.
So, as we've been seeing for the third day in a row, Ukrainian officials say that Russian shelling has prevented civilians from being evacuated from several cities across the country. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, is in the capital, Kiev, and there has been more activity there this evening. Lise, what's the latest?
Yes, the night is quiet now, Rita, but these are very unpredictable times. And a few hours ago, around 6 GMT, the city was rocked by very loud explosions, no closer than we've seen over recent days, which they're usually about 10 to 12 miles away. But it sounded as though the Russians were using much heavy ordnance, and we could see the Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles streaking across the sky. It suggests that Russia is intensifying its pressure on the capital. Even as the shelling continues to the northwest of the city, Russia is in control of some of those towns and the approaches here to Kiev. And as we've been seeing, they've intensified the attacks on Irpin, where so many refugees are trying to flee, raising questions about whether a safe corridor can be established, as Russia said, to get people out of this area to greater safety.
Lise, thank you very much. Lise Doucet reporting there from Kiev. Well, opposition to the war continues to be silenced in Russia, as thousands have been detained for protesting against the invasion. Meanwhile, world leaders continue to meet to try to find a way through the crisis, with the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visiting Eastern European nations today. Our diplomatic correspondent Caroline Hawley has this report.
They flew in from their battle-ravaged nation, the Ukrainian delegation arriving on the border with Belarus for a third round of talks with the enemy, with more meetings planned. But there's almost no faith in the sincerity of Russia's side. The Russian Defence Ministry today released these images, said to be of tanks around Ukraine's capital, Kiev. It is the military hardware, the guns and the bombs that are doing the talking. And the Kremlin has repeatedly made clear it'll be satisfied by nothing short of Ukraine's surrender. No to war, this Russian man shouts before he's carted away. Independent monitors say 5,000 people were taken into custody over the weekend at protests in dozens of Russian cities, at a war that you're not even allowed to name. Russia is now stepping up its repression, silencing all opposition. Virtually all independent media in the country has ceased to function. And a new symbol has emerged to signify support for President Putin's war. The letter Z first appeared on tanks and military vehicles, but it's now also on bus stops and businesses and elsewhere. Look carefully and you'll see that it's even on this gymnast's chest, as he took bronze at a World Cup event in Qatar. It was Ukraine who took gold. The quick victory Moscow had hoped for in Ukraine has failed to materialise. Russian forces have actually taken very little territory over the past week, and instead have resorted to bombing and shelling, causing ever more civilian suffering.
What's the difference between the peaceful residents of Kharkiv or Mykolaiv and Hamburg or Vienna? We are waiting for a decision. Either you clear the skies by the force you have, or you give us military aircraft or anti-aircraft defences, which would give us the necessary force. This is the help which the world should provide not simply to Ukraine, but to themselves, in order to prove that humanity will prevail.
Western allies continue to meet day in, day out on what more they can do to support Ukraine, what more pressure they can put on President Putin. But there's very little hope at the moment of getting Russia around a table for meaningful talks that would actually stop the war. Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
There'll be more from us a little later in the programme, but for now it's back to you, Huw.
Rita, many thanks. We'll see you in a short while. Well, tomorrow will mark a new departure for the House of Commons, where MPs will be able to watch a live video link of an address by President Zelensky of Ukraine. Screens are being installed in the chamber overnight. More than 500 headsets will be provided. And the President is expected to call, as we've just heard, for more arms to help defend his country and to renew demands for a no-fly zone. Earlier today, Boris Johnson met the Dutch and Canadian Prime Ministers and spoke to leaders in France, Germany and the US, all of whom agreed that the goal was to isolate President Putin and to ensure Russia's eventual failure. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, has more details.
Lining up allies has not been the hard part. The chaos in Ukraine a contrast to the neat ranks of UK airmen and women.
How are you doing? Thanks for looking after us.
Thank you for looking after us, he says. The Prime Minister, the Dutch and the Canadian leader trying together to look after Ukraine.
Our three countries stand shoulder to shoulder against Russia's barbaric invasion.
We're standing up for democracy against authoritarianism and standing with Ukraine.
As war and violence once again cast a dark shadow over Europe, we are working together. And I'd like to think
there was a promise of extra cash, more coordination of humanitarian help. But what about bolder, bigger pressure? Cutting off Russian oil and gas.
You can't simply close down use of oil and gas overnight, even from Russia. That's obviously not something that every country around the world can do. I'm going to be setting out an energy strategy, an energy supply strategy for the country in the days ahead.
What Vladimir Putin has broken here is a trust where I've heard a number of Europeans reflect on, it's too bad that we are so dependent on Russian oil, but we're not going to make that mistake again, and they are moving away from it.
Thank you.
Easier to say than do, and the dilemma is displayed by these three countries. Canadians have banned Russian oil, but they have their own huge supply. The UK doesn't rely on it either, but the Dutch, like other mainland European countries, really do.
we have to ramp up, speed up the process of greening our economy, decarbonizing our economies, but that will not happen overnight. I would really urge all of us to take this step by step.
Why can you say to our viewers that the West was so slow to see what Vladimir Putin was really capable of? Do you feel that was wishful thinking or naivety? Some people in Eastern Europe feel that Western Europe has been naive.
There has been all of that. We all thought that we could somehow contain this.
That proved impossible. And after calls for more drastic action against those who sought luxury lifestyles in London, Parliament's trying this week to make it harder for Russians to stash cash here and easier to punish those with links to the Kremlin after accusations the government isn't tough enough.
If the government allows people 6 months to register their property, anybody who thinks they're going to be subject to sanction will sell their property. And that's why we've been pushing the government.
Boris Johnson is making a big diplomatic push this week. It's about sticking together, the West showing solidarity and squeezing Russia. But neither of them can promise today that any of the solutions that could end Ukraine's suffering are straightforward.
Tomorrow, Parliament will hear direct, if digitally, from the Ukrainian President Zelensky. His plea for much more help, the Prime Minister's mantra, Putin must fail. Both easier to say tonight than to guarantee. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
As we mentioned earlier, households and businesses are being warned to prepare themselves for even higher energy bills in future because of the disruption to the energy market. On the international markets, the prices of oil and gas have taken off again, with oil hitting a 14-year high and wholesale gas prices doubling in the space of just 3 days. Food prices are also set to rise, with one industry boss warning of a global food crisis. Our economics editor, Faisal Islam, has the story.
Ukrainian farmers are seeing a very different type of harvest during this invasion. Social media images of tractors towing abandoned Russian military hardware in the fields where seeds should be being sown in one of the breadbaskets of the world.
And today, half of the world's population is fed using food grown with mineral fertilizer.
One of the world's biggest fertilizer companies said a global food crisis started.
Not whether we are moving towards a global food crisis, it's how large the food crisis will be. For other parts of the world, the most vulnerable, it's a matter of getting access to food at all. It's a matter of life or death.
As wheat exports from Ukraine and Russia dry up, the UN said overall food prices, even when adjusted for inflation, have only risen faster in 1 year, 1974. There's a similar picture for gas prices. Markets surged to about £6 a therm, treble what they were pre-crisis, 12 times the normal price. If in the first half of this year prices averaged just over £3 a therm, then average household energy bills in October could top £250 per month. The incredible rises in gas prices already represent an energy price shock for households, in particular businesses and those using heating oil that face this immediately. It is, though, crude oil that could be the most potent economic weapon against the Kremlin because it gets 3 times as much income from oil than from gas. But an embargo on Russian oil risks a 70s-style energy crisis, and it's long been Mr. Putin's calculation that Western governments and Western populations won't want to pay a price so high. Even a conversation about sanctions on Russia's oil saw the price of a barrel of crude oil leap to a 14-year high this morning before settling still up on the day. Even before this, pump petrol prices are now on average £1.55 a litre and heading higher. Russia's economy is already taking a hit.
We see the ruble going through the floor. We see Russia's credit rating coming basically to zero, to junk status.
The ruble at new record lows has now halved in value, but across Europe it's not yet the time to choke off the flows of dollars and euros to Russia and oil from it. Faisal Islam, BBC News.
The UK's policy on accepting Ukrainian refugees has been widely criticised in recent days, with complaints that the British system is far less generous than others. The Home Office confirmed tonight that 300 visas have been issued so far under a new scheme, but more than 8,000 applications have been submitted, and refugees waiting at Calais say that there is lots of confusion over the process. Our Home Editor, Mark Easton, has been speaking to some of those affected.
The faces at this Calais hostel bear the trauma of a nightmare flight from war, a journey still without a destination. There are more than 500 Ukrainian refugees in this city trying to sort visas to the UK. Misha, a British citizen with his Ukrainian wife and children, was turned back at the border 5 days ago.
I feel like I've been gutted. Who else is going to help me if not my own government? I'm paying taxes, I'm living out there nearly 30 years now. Never asked for any kind of help from government before. I've never been on the benefits, and I've done one thing I asked and I've been left out.
Misha's 17-year-old daughter Gabrielle could barely speak about her experience.
I don't want to.
It's so hard for everybody.
She's been crying all these days, man, and she just stopped now.
We followed Misha as he tried to navigate the bureaucracy. First he came here, an administrative building where refugees were told they might get advice.
Speaking at the weekend, the Home Secretary said she had surged a team of Home Office officials here to Calais, and it was inaccurate to say there was no proper support on the ground. But this is the place. No sign of a surge, just a telephone number.
Misha rang the number.
I'm trying to find where I see you, where I can see someone.
And was eventually told there were refugee support personnel in Calais, in an empty port building. Was this the promised Home Office help?
They didn't want us to film what's going on, but this, it appears, is the British surge. 3 officials, a box of ready salted crisps and some Kit Kats.
Only a handful of refugees have managed to find and reach this desk.
Clearly this crisis is evolving the whole time, and I've said before that the UK will be as generous as we can possibly be.
You can't find out how to get a visa?
Well, at the moment, I don't know.
But this afternoon, the Home Office confirmed what many refugees had feared. There is no visa centre in Calais. Misha and his family must stay in France at least another week and get their visa not here, but in Paris. To the Ukrainian refugees in northern France, there appears to be a gap as wide as the English Channel between the supportive rhetoric of ministers in London and the reality on the ground. Mark Easton, BBC News, Calais.
Time for the latest on the pandemic, and more than 6 million people have now died around the world after testing positive for COVID-19. That's according to the latest research in the US. And here in the UK, a new study has found that even mild cases of COVID can cause long-term changes to the brain, as our science editor Rebecca Morell explains.
We're starting to see the precise impacts of COVID on the brain as UK Biobank undertakes the world's biggest scanning project.
The task is about to start.
Scientists have compared brain scans recorded before the pandemic with images taken after a COVID-19 infection.
The scans revealed changes in the brain of the participants who'd had COVID. Almost all of them, 96%, had had a mild case. The researchers found that on average, the overall size of the brain had shrunk by up to 2%. There was a loss of grey matter in the parts of the brain related to the sense of smell and memory. And those who'd been infected found it harder to perform complex mental tasks.
These differences in the changes.
The scientists have been trying to assess what the changes mean.
The infected participants also had more difficulties, greater difficulties in performing complex tasks compared with those who did not get infected. And we can relate that to how much of their brain had shrunk So yes, it does have a real life kind of consequences.
What's not yet clear is whether the changes are permanent or if they can be reversed.
It can get scary to hear about the fact that your brain has shrunk, but we need to bear in mind that the brain is really plastic. By that we mean it can heal itself.
The study could also help researchers to better understand long COVID. It didn't look at the condition specifically, but the hope is the findings could provide new clues.
I think it's a good starting point, and that opens up all sorts of questions that other researchers can follow up in long COVID clinics and so on about the effect of coronavirus infection on cognitive function, brain fog and other areas of the brain, and to really focus research on how best to mitigate that.
This study is just the start. It looked at earlier variants of COVID. It's unclear whether Omicron would cause the same changes. The hope is further scans will help us to understand the legacy left by COVID-19. Rebecca Morrell, BBC News.
So on the eve of that historic address that I mentioned by President Zelensky to the House of Commons, let's rejoin Rita in the city of Lviv in western Ukraine.
Huw, thank you. Well, for months, Vladimir Putin denied repeatedly that Russia would invade its neighbour. And even as President Putin marshalled tens of thousands of his military forces up near Ukraine's borders, the country's leaders sought to reassure people that war was not inevitable. Well, today's awful reality is one that many Ukrainians didn't think that they would be facing. Our special correspondent Fergal Keane has caught up with 3 people that he met in the last days of peace.
We didn't imagine this. That these streets of Chernihiv, where we'd walked last month, would now be a place of fire. But even as we took a group photograph on the nearby northern border, the Russians were close, getting ready. A thought that haunts our Ukrainian producer Sofia.
I couldn't believe that it's happened in the same place. So when I was there with you, I didn't believe at all.
Within a fortnight, Sofia was a refugee, fleeing to join her family on the Polish border.
Anna.
Her daughter Anna, aged 4, exiled but safe. Now, from the Polish city of Krakow, Sofia told me of life outside her country.
Every day and night, just thinking what will be next. So it's very stressful. But still, if I speak with Ukrainians who are still in Ukraine, I can't say that I'm stressed because they are more stressed than me.
Not far from the border, down along the roads now dominated by the Russian army,
1989.
we met Valery and Galena. He's Ukrainian, she's Russian, married 40 years, and worried even then about broken relationships with Russian friends and family.
It's terrible because we lose a lot of friends. We have no food in the supermarket.
Now I can only reach them online. They're trapped inside a town, surrounded by the Russians.
You even cannot imagine. All people got together and waiting for Russians to kill them.
How is Galina?
Hi, Galina.
Hi.
I feel only disappointment and anger, and I cannot understand how this could be happening. This isn't possible.
In Kiev, at the end of our journey then, we witnessed the beginning of another.
Hello.
Vasily and Olga Zelensky with their newborn baby, Yaromir. His name means peace.
We need to think about a better life, especially now when we have such a miracle in our arms. We can't think about bad things anymore.
But not long after, this came. the invasion that forced them to flee to the countryside ahead of the Russian advance.
Olga, what is it like for you, all of this now, with the baby and the war?
We met your team a week before the war started. Who would have thought that when our son was 2 weeks old, we were going to speak here, right now, after seeing these rockets flying over our house? To say that I was shocked is saying nothing. That's why our whole lives turned all over, from head to toe.
But Jaromir gives them hope.
He is superstar.
Maybe he knows that.
All of these people once lived in peace, caused no harm to anyone. That is the kind of world they stand for and which they hope can return for their children. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Lviv.
Well, things here remain ominously uncertain. In this part of Ukraine, it has been relatively calm. But tonight we learned that the British ambassador, who was based in this city, has now left the country entirely because of the serious security situation. And that's a reminder, if it were needed, of the possibility of a further escalation. Well, that is all from us tonight here in the city of Lviv. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a very good night. Bye-bye.